Hello to everyone joining us on today's webinar. Good morning to those of you joining us from the States. Good afternoon, middle of the afternoon to those of us here in Europe, and good evening to those of us joining us from Asia Pacific. Welcome to the Conference Board's webinar on More Than a Feeling about defining and measuring inclusion. I'm really pleased to be hosting this webinar today. So my name is Sarah Bond and I'm the Council Director for Conference Board's European Diversity and Inclusion Council, and also Institute Leader for the Conference Board's Global Diversity and Inclusion Research Institute. And I'm going to be your moderator and also contributor for today's webcast. And I'm really, as I say, really delighted to be here with you today. Before we begin, just some practical information about today's session. The first thing is that we really want it to be an interactive discussion. And so we'd love it if you would ask questions as they occur to you about measuring and defining inclusion. And you can do so in the bottom left hand of your screen. I'll do my best to weave them into the conversation as we go, but we could always follow up by a webinar at the end of the session if necessary. Do take the time, if you'd like to download the presentation, which you can do through the file download in the bottom center of your screen. And you can full screen the video too, if that's easier for you. We'll remind you of this at the end, but do please complete the brief evaluation form at the end. We'd love to be able to incorporate your comments for future webinars. And if you found it of interest, then do please share this programme with your colleagues too. It will be available on demand. There are credits available for the session too. And to earn those credits, you need to stay online for the entire webcast. Okay. So without further ado, what I'd really love to do to you now, is to introduce you to the people who are behind the research on which the session is based and who are going to be the main speakers in today's session. I'd like first of all to introduce you to Marion Devine, who's Senior Human Capital Researcher for Conference Board in Europe. Marion.
Hello everybody, it's great to be with you this afternoon.
Lovely, thanks very much Marion. And also behind this research is Mary Young, who's Principal Researcher of Human Capital in the States. Mary, hello.
Hello, everyone from sunny Florida.
Hi, Mary. Lovely to have you with us today. And as I say, really delighted to be hosting this webinar with you both. We're going to approach the webinar in two halves. So this webinar is about defining and measuring inclusion. For the first half of the webinar, Marion's going to be presenting on the findings of the research around definitions of inclusion. And then we will take a break for discussion between us and to answer your questions that come up. And then we'll move on to Mary talking about measuring inclusion. But as I say, we'll see how it goes in terms of questions and comments throughout the webinar. Just a little bit in terms of the rationale for the research. I thought it might be useful for those of you joining this webinar to hear some of the background to why we started investigating the question of measuring and defining inclusion. Really, the idea for the research came out of discussion that we had with member companies of Conference Board's Diversity and Inclusion Councils in Europe, the US, and Asia Pacific. And I think it's fair to say that when we started off thinking about the research, our intention was really to focus on the measurement of inclusion. But then we realized, of course, that it's difficult to measure something if you don't know what it means or if you're not clear about what inclusion means. So we had to sort of step back, roll things back a little bit and really began to research what we mean by definitions of inclusion. And what we found back in February 2018, when this research kicked off, was that companies were sort of struggling, if you like, to define inclusion in a meaningful way. There were lots of definitions of inclusion, and Marion will talk about those. But there was no, often they were pretty generic sort of definitions, and there was certainly no consensus over the factors that contributed to inclusion in organisations. There was a lot of agreement, we found, over how to measure diversity, but the same was absolutely not the case around inclusion. And part of the issue that we kept coming up against, and again, Mary will talk about this in her section, is that measuring inclusion was very much about the measurement of intangibles, and that was one of the things that seemed to be getting in the way of company approaches to measurement of inclusion. So I wanted to share that with you, just to give you a bit of background, if you like, and rationale for the research a year or so ago. In terms of the methodology for the research, for those who are interested in that sort of thing, it was primarily a qualitative research study. So it was conducted with focus groups with conference board corporate members of the diversity and inclusion councils in US and Europe, and then with discussion with conference board's Global Diversity and Inclusion Institute Research Board as well, who provided, all of whom actually provided really great insight through one-to-one conversations and indeed through focus groups with both Mary and Marion. Okay, so with that as background, I'm going to turn now to the first section of this webinar, which is really about defining inclusion. And I'm going to ask Marion, if you would, Marion, please, to lead us through what did you find when you were talking with companies and with individuals about this question of definitions of inclusion? Marion.
Yeah, Sarah, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, I'm afraid you haven't got my visual at the moment, but hopefully it will come back. Yeah, I think in our first slide, we obviously found that to talk about measuring inclusion, you really had to understand how companies think about inclusion, how they define it. And we came across this definition from Bernard Myers, who's the VP of Inclusion at Netflix. And we think it's a great saying, it's very memorable, but actually it really does fall short of what we saw in our research, because inclusion is very much more than being asked to the dance. Because if someone's asking you, then how included are you really in that? If someone else is deciding to invite you, and then if they know the steps and you don't, or if they decided on the playlist and you haven't, does that really get us to the complex nature of inclusion? And so, and I think actually though, it's interesting. I think I want to just point out to people that you know, we have this really great quote from Netflix, but you know, even Netflix, a leading organization, they are really struggling with inclusion. And you know, they dismissed their corporate communications head, global head, in 2018 for saying some unfortunate things. And you know, they are really working hard in that whole area of inclusion and incorporate it into their values and then into their culture. So you know, it's a journey, I think, for everybody. And I don't think there are many organizations out there who would say that they are ahead. So in our research, we found that actually the more thoughtful the companies that we spoke to, the more they actually struggle to really define inclusion in a way that meant something to them as an organization. And we saw various different concepts, and some of that did vary around the world, but very much the idea of authenticity, I would say, is becoming a much more important value, and I think that's linked to wanting organizations to be innovative and creative, and to be innovative and creative, you want your employees to bring in everything, all their life experience, all their perceptions. We also found that the issue of belonging, and one company said to us that for millennials, belonging is a really important value for them. And another one that I thought was really interesting was that for one company, their definition of inclusion was very much linked to agile. So the person, our interviewee, said inclusion is increasingly defined as breaking down hierarchy. It's expecting disagreement, it's listening, it's challenging. And for them, hierarchy was the loudest voice in the room. So that was how they thought about inclusion. So I think that that's a really important thing to understand, and it's a really important thing to understand where companies are starting in terms of where they're measuring inclusion, because some companies are starting trying to look at, say, the business impact, and some are looking much more at the individual employee. So we found that there are many different challenges in defining inclusion, and how important it is to have the right definition, because if it's wrong, you are measuring the wrong things, and not just measuring, you're having a whole wrong conversation, and you are not, hitting on the things that really count in your organization. And there are various roadblocks that we saw. Now, one of them, paralysis, and a quote, we ran a 5-day immersion meeting on inclusion and didn't reach a common definition. Some of you out there might be saying, seriously, what was wrong with that organization? But this was an organization we interviewed that was very, very sophisticated. And they had, they'd used the maturity index developed by Burson by Deloitte. They had done a lot of work, but they were really frustrated. They felt they were treading water when it came to inclusion, and they were really working hard to get their leaders on board. And so this 5-day meeting was all about getting the leadership involved to really understand and grapple with, what does inclusion mean for us? So that paralysis is not from, a lack of thought. It's a really big effort to get everybody involved and have a rich debate. And there are cultural nuances, and we're actually going to do another report later this year just to study that, because that word doesn't mean the same in different countries. And so our French members said, we don't have a word in France, not really. It's closer to integration. And fluff, in anything around values, we know that in the effort to be inclusive, you can end up with a definition that really is quite meaningless and doesn't do anything for anyone. So where we felt in the end was we felt that we could come up with a model of inclusion that reflected what we were seeing in our research. And it seemed to us that inclusion has 3 dimensions. A lot of companies, I would say, perhaps only look at it at 1 or 2 dimensions, and not necessarily these 3 that we think are key. And in our webcasts and in our briefings, we've had a lot of interest from our members about the fact that there is these 3 dimensions that we argue for. So there is that one about the feelings. We look at where is inclusion in the workplace, and yes, definitely look inside for the individual's perceptions and their sense of being heard and seen and listened to and respected, to have a voice. So that's, I think, where a lot of really good work has been done by companies. But it is between individuals. It is in those interaction between colleagues. It's that interaction within teams and between teams. It's that interaction between individuals and their line managers. And in these days of global business and companies that are adopting many different structures internally, and maybe also have quite a complicated matrix organization, those relationships are becoming more complex and perhaps more diverse. So understanding inclusion in that in the relational bit, I think is really important. And companies also, we think inclusion lives outside, and it is around the qualities of an organization or the workforce that contribute to inclusiveness. And so this is around culture. It is about structure. It is about hierarchy or breaking down hierarchy. It is about policies. So, for example, you may have a great policy for parental leave, but if some of those employees who need it the most feel they can't access it, well, that's an area where you need to be thinking about what happens in your organisation and how it pertains to inclusion. So those are the 3 dimensions that we want to share with you today. And I think,
Marion, it's Sarah here. Could I just ask you a question about those? Would that be all right?
Yes, of course, yeah.
So I really love this definition, and it's presented in the report, and this idea that inclusion is kind of intrapersonal. It's about what's going on in the individual, what's going on between individuals, and then what's going on in the organisation, and those 3 dimensions. I wonder of the people the organisations that you spoke to, whether many were defining inclusion in those 3 dimensions, or whether you saw them defining inclusion primarily in terms of the inside, people's feelings of inclusion, or primarily in terms of what goes on in the organisation. Did you get a sense of where organisations were currently placing the emphasis.
Yeah, well, I think it'd be interesting to see if Mary agrees with this, but I think my strong impression is that companies are very much looking at inclusion in terms of how people experience it. So it's the perception of inclusion.
Right.
I think that when it comes to the between bit, in terms of relational, I think quite a few companies that we spoke to were really talking about leaders and understanding that leadership behaviour is really important for inclusion, and leadership accountability, leaders taking responsibility for some of that. I think that companies are finding it difficult to think about inclusion in terms of the qualities of the workplace and the organisation. And certainly we need so much more work on the business impact of, how inclusion actually, the outcomes of inclusion in terms of the benefits to the business. So yes, definitely 1 and a bit of 2, but really not much in 3.
Thank you.
Yeah, so in our work as well, we also realised that to get at inclusion, you had to really understand as well the nature of inclusion, and it is continuously created. It is not static, and it is affected by events like a merger or a failed merger, or sudden change, or announcing a job loss, or scandals. Someone resulting in a high level sacking of someone. So all those things can have an impact on inclusion. It's context specific. If you're talking about relationships, it's not meaningful unless you really talk about the context of that relationship, which interaction you're talking about, which sort of team or colleague, day-to-day colleagues that you work with. And it is individual and personal, but we know as well that there are some common themes, but you sort of have to strike this balance between understanding that there are some very, very, in the true sense of the word, idiosyncratic qualities of inclusion, but there are some as well that do stretch across your organisation and cultures. So I think that the definition that we came up with, that we felt was incorporate those elements of our inclusion, of our research, was that in an inclusive workplace, everyone feels respected, valued for being who they are. People trust is an important thing, that they can speak up and be fairly treated. Fairness was an important concept we saw, and they share a sense of belonging. And we felt as part of that definition, we should also emphasise that it's not a steady state, it's continuously created through the ways people in the organisation operate. And I guess that whole thing about ultimately, if people can do their best work, then organisations can gain the full benefit of a diverse workforce. So that's a definition that we're offering up to our members in the hope that that will be helpful and that they can sort of build on that. So finally, we would just like to suggest that when it comes to creating a definition or honing a definition that fits your company, you can't take it off the shelf. You really need to develop something that makes sense in your culture, in your situation. I would just urge you to think about the process that you're using to develop and testing and refining your definition. You need to make it inclusive in itself. If it's a top-down approach or a central approach, if D&I with the best motives is driving it, then that's going to perhaps limit the powerfulness of the definition that you reach. And know that will evolve over time. So don't beat yourself up. It will evolve. It needs to evolve. And so having that sort of flexibility built into revisiting it is fine. You have to be clear without being simplistic. Easier said than done, but that is the reality. And we really recommend that you encompass the inside, the between, and the outside aspects. So we also found as well that companies, when it came to using an inclusive process, employee research groups, resource groups can be a really, really valuable resource. But there are also other groups of people, perhaps blue-collar workers, perhaps part-time workers, even contingent workers. So just think about who those people are and try to sort of work them into that process. So back to you, Sarah.
Marion, thanks very much indeed. That's really, thank you. There's some really interesting input there, I hope, for people on the call in thinking not only about what might be included in the definition of inclusion, but also about the process by which you go about defining inclusion for your company. Just in terms of the definition of inclusion, Marion and Mary actually call, I am wondering about how global you think that definition of inclusion might be. I mean, I know that obviously that the research was qualitative, small scale, sort of in-depth research, and so it's not going to be necessarily representative. But I was reading Conference Board's research, C-suite research on the sort of priorities of C-suite challenges earlier on today, and there it was really interesting to see what inclusiveness means for different people in the C-suite in different areas of the world. Because, for instance, in Japan, the Conference Board research talks about transparency being one of the sort of the top competency or trait that defines a truly inclusive organization, compared to this sense of creating a sense of belonging, which was the top trait for respondents to this C-suite survey from China, Latin America, and Europe. And I was wondering if in your conversations with people, you got much of a sense, or you were able to get much of a sense of similarities and differences, if you like, in terms of definitions of inclusion from different cultures or areas of the globe.
Yeah.
Do either of you have any thoughts about that?
I think that people touched on it, and that's why we want to look at this in a lot more detail. But I think that it's a very complex question, because you have national cultures, and you have corporate cultures, and you have local corporate cultures, and you have a sort of global corporate culture that you're trying to sort of promulgate and spread across your organization. So trying to sort of work out which is which is really, really difficult. But I think that there is definitely this sense that you can come up with a sort of global definition, but it's really important to touch base with your local D&I teams and make sure that they're in that sort of part of that conversation. I think as well, something that sort of comes to mind is the need for flex. So companies that were starting to think about it were sort of thinking, we need some common global definitions and concepts, and we need to actively communicate them, even if perhaps nationally or culturally there's a difficulty with it. But we also need to build in just a little bit of flexibility, so that if in a local context there's a particular trait or value around inclusion that they need, then we can build that in. And I think as well, when it comes to thinking about global differences, one real difficulty is that if you are valuing something around inclusion that actually actively goes against that local national culture, for example, in how you treat women. So for example, in the Middle East, you as a company may be very committed to giving junior women access to senior leaders and senior male leaders. And that can be a problem in some cultures where men and women are not really allowed to work together. So having to think around those things is really demanding.
Okay, so the definition of inclusion that Conference Boards, this research has generated, I think what I hear you say is it's a starting point really for companies, and then to develop and evolve that based on the sort of inclusive process that you're talking about on the slide that's in front of us here.
Yeah, and then also realize, a need for some degree of flexibility as well for national understanding.
Yeah, great, thank you. There's just one comment. That diversity of thought is one aspect that we have here in Europe, and I think, that's absolutely right. There was a really good article from Harvard Business Review for May 2018, and that talks about diversity being about demographic diversity, cognitive diversity, which sort of diversity of thought and mindset and approach, and then experiential diversity. Diversity around of experience. And so Fabienne, your comment about diversity of thought, I think that's exactly right. Mary, sorry, did you want to say something there?
Oh, I could always throw in some more examples of that kind of the global differences. You know, we heard people say that in some countries where there was a very strong collectivist culture, that people might have less need to belong to the organization because they had such strong ties to their community and family. We heard people say that in some Asian countries, really the most important thing is respect. And then, thirdly, to Marion's point about differences, for example, in the treatment of women or the rights of LGBTQ employees, we heard companies that said, you know, some of these things are non negotiable. In our company, we are going to stand up for certain things, even and that relate to how you're treated in the workplace, even though they may not be consistent with some national values. So, you know, I think that this is something that companies are going to have to work out, and you know the challenges will differ depending on where they operate.
Thank you, Mary. I wonder if we might try a poll now, actually, of people on the call, because on the webinar. A question that we are particularly interested in, that Mary and Marion were exploring, obviously, is the kinds of definitions of inclusion that companies were using. So our first poll, if we're able to have that, asks, does your company use a generic definition of inclusion, or has it developed a company-specific one? And the options on that poll are either generic or company specific. And we'd love to know what your, you know, how you're defining inclusion, either in generic terms or company specific, on the call. Okay. So thank you. As people are entering their responses, I can see that they're changing slightly, but I think we could probably broadcast the results as an immediate pattern here, which is that around 2/3 of those of you on the webinar have a company-specific definition of inclusion, and 1/3 of you, or maybe 60% of you, have a company-specific, and 40% of you use a generic definition of inclusion. And that's really interesting, I think, and really points to Marion's point about needing a definition of inclusion which works for your company. Great, thank you very much for that. I'd really like to ask Mary now to share the results around measurement of inclusion. But before we do so, and just as perhaps an entry into the next bit of the webinar, I also want to ask people on the webinar about whether your company measures inclusion. So I'm going to ask you just to respond to this second poll, which is, does your company actually measure inclusion? Okay, if we can show the results for that. So a slightly different pattern of results. Around half of people responding to this poll on the webinar, around half of companies measure inclusion, and around half don't. And that's also really interesting as well, in terms of you know, what we imagine and what we know is that many more companies talk about inclusion and have inclusion as a priority in their organizations than are actually measuring it. And Mary's going to talk to us now about what she found, what Marion and Mary found in terms of company approaches to measuring inclusion. Mary, can I hand it over to you for that?
Okay, thank you very much. So, you know that from what Sarah said, we initially were interested in measuring inclusion, but we had to take a step backwards when our members said, well, we're still debating what that is, or we don't feel confident about the definition. But here we now get to the initial focus, which is, are companies measuring inclusion? And if so, how are they doing it? So let me walk you through some of the challenges we heard about. One of them was we heard D&I leaders say, our executives say you can't measure inclusion because it's a subjective experience. That's something that sort of brings my I get passionate about, because of course there are many things that are subjective that we measure. We for example, employee experience or engagement, but we also, the measurement of subjective and feelings is widespread if you think about it. Political pollsters or public health or marketers, for heaven's sakes, who are measuring people's perceptions of the company or its products. So don't let that stop you, but that is a common challenge. Another one we saw, and I'll be talking more about this, is even D&I leaders and even some D&I consulting firms continue to use measures which really are measures of diversity and think that they're measuring inclusion. So that's a challenge. Another one is we see companies, many, and I wonder if we had more time, we would like to ask you whether you're using questions on your engagement survey. That is, questions that you already had in your engagement survey, but saying, hey, this 3 or 4 really relate to inclusion, so let's call these our inclusion index. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just, it's a good place to start, as one of our interviewees said. And this was somebody from Microsoft, and they're really quite good. They're quite intent on measuring inclusion. As with any sort of qualitative workforce measure, there are some limitations. If you're just measuring this once a year or once every 2 years, you're only getting a snapshot. We found companies were often cutting their results based on the most available, the easiest to get variables, like men versus women, or where someone works geographically, or perhaps age. Those are really readily available variables, but those may not be the most important cuts to look at. So, but focusing just on these most obvious ones it can be a challenge or a limitation. We saw lots of D&I leaders who said our business leaders want us to prove the business impacts of inclusion, which is a very difficult thing to include, to measure, because you can't control all the other factors that could be driving business outcomes. And that's true for almost any organizational variable. And then we heard very interesting and thoughtful questions from some of our members who said, okay, measure inclusion and you get these numbers, but what do they mean? If 80% of our workforce feels included, is that good enough? Should we be aiming for 85? Is 90 realistic? And do we care about which segments is it particularly important that certain segments feel highly included, less important that other segments so these are very important sort of philosophical questions that go beyond just getting percentages. So these are challenges we heard about in our interviews. And I think I have okay. Our results suggest that the best way to do this is to use a combination of methods. That is, everybody thinks about using surveys, and they're perfectly good. But if you want to understand what the results are telling you, or if you want to develop customized questions that reflect the issues that people in your workforce say matter, then you might want to combine the surveys with qualitative research, like the kinds of focus groups Marion talked about, or interviews, to go beyond the numbers. And then finally, we're going to talk about some sort of leading edge ways of collecting additional data using technology. And we think that this is going to really enrich our understanding of inclusion as companies do this more and more. So let me move now and tell you about, in our report, which you as conference board members can download, we have an assortment of qualitative rather quantitative questions using a 1.5, a 1 to 5 scale. And I won't read through these, but you'll see that the questions address the 3 components of inclusion. How you feel, like I'm comfortable being myself at work. The in-between aspect about my leader creates an environment where I feel comfortable. And the inclusion on the outside of the individual. So, how do you perceive the organization's in this like commitment or its policies or practices, et cetera, as all being, these are all components of inclusion. So you can see this is a much more 3-dimensional way of understanding the inclusiveness of your organization that goes beyond just asking people about their perceptions and feelings, as important as those are. In terms of qualitative questions, again, our report offers a much larger list of these, but they do hit on the 3 different aspects of inclusion. And with all of these, there's the opportunity in qualitative research to ask probes afterwards. What do you mean by that? Why or why not? Give me an example of when that happened, et cetera. And as you can tell, this is going to give you much richer kinds of insights about your workforce and inclusion. So just to wrap up this part of it, I want to reemphasize what is probably one of my hot button issues, and don't let anybody tell you that you can't measure inclusion because it's too subjective. And you can always probe beneath the subjectivity by asking people to talk more about specific behaviors. Going back to a point that Sarah raised when she asked, did we see companies who were looking at 3 aspects of inclusion? And I thought, in answer to that question, it's almost like a maturity model where companies start out inevitably thinking about what people feel and what their perceptions are. And those are the questions they ask. And then, for example, at Bristol Myers Squibb, one of our examples in the report, employees said, okay, we understand inclusion and we know what it feels like. Now tell us what the behaviors are that would make us a more inclusive organization. So that was moving more to the in-between. And then we also heard from really sort of leading edge thinkers who said you have to look at the way the organization itself communicates and reinforces inclusion or doesn't do so, because those are also defining what the experience is, and you can't just intervene at the level of individuals or teams, leaders, et cetera, as important as that is. Okay, another final thought here is like your definition, your measures are going to get better over time. And I think as our source, Don Klinghoffer at Microsoft said, it's just important to start measuring, and then you can work on developing better measures or getting more sophisticated in your analysis, and you're going to get better and better at it. Another thing I feel really passionately about, and we saw this in our research, is D&I should not be doing this on its own. The most obvious partner for you is your people analytics, workforce analytics, human capital analytics, whatever you call it, the people in your organization who are experts at collecting data and analyzing it to gain insights. And if you're not working with them, then you really should be, because they can be helpful in not only helping you design questions, but also gain deeper insights from the data. They can cut that data using a whole range of human capital or demographic variables and give you much more insight, because you're probably within your your D&I team, not experts in data and analytics. Although I have to say, we interviewed one company where they actually have brought that into D&I. They have a D&I analytics team within D&I because they see that is such an important enhancement. But human capital analytics is not the only function or group within HR who can be helpful to you. My doctorate is in organizational behavior. And as we did this research, I thought back to the earliest days of organizational science or organizational behavior. The very first theorists who began thinking about what it is that makes for an effective organization. And they talked about the very same variables that we're talking about with inclusion: sense of belonging, the ability to speak up, the feeling of being able to bring your whole self, of being listened to and having opportunities to contribute and be valued. Later on, people who studied group dynamics and saw what are the markers of the most effective teams and groups identified exactly some of those same factors as important contributors to the effectiveness of teams. I think back to when I was in graduate school, which was the heyday of work-life or work-family initiatives. And then those people who were, a brand new function within HR or within the organization, the work-family, work-life professionals, were interested in how you create climates and cultures that are truly inclusive of all people, parents and non-parents, and don't marginalize those who are parents, or particularly women. More recently, people who look at the employee experience and employee engagement are also stakeholders in this. So I think that it's an accident of history. The D&I function emerged as a result in part of employment regulations and the need to ensure fair treatment, equal opportunity, et cetera. And as that function evolved, it became very clear to everyone that simply having variety, a demographic variety, did not get you where you wanted to go. So there was a focus on inclusion. And now we see in many companies, sometimes it's called inclusion and diversity, sometimes the other way around. But this does not have to be a burden that D&I carries on its shoulders alone. I really think it's important to make this a broader sort of agenda, and know that everybody from organizational effectiveness and OD to employee engagement is really working towards these same things. It's not just D&I's problem, so to speak. Okay, that's my second soapbox, and I'll climb back down now.
No, Mary, that's great. Thank you ever so much. There were some really interesting questions and comments coming through on the chat. So a couple of things that I just wanted to ask you and Marion, please. I guess the first thing, just to summarize, what I think this research is saying is that when we measure inclusion, there are, as Marion said, three things, if you like, to measure. There's the employee experience, there's the intrapersonal, there's the interpersonal, and then there's the organizational. And then I think what you're saying, Mary, is that the measurement of those three, there are three different approaches to measurement, which can either be qualitative, quantitative, or, as you talked about, Mary, these new kind of data analytics approaches. So I can almost imagine there's a sort of 9 box, if you like, things to measure and ways to measure to get deeper into what we actually mean by inclusion and the metrics of inclusion. One of the comments, which is really a really interesting comment, is, we often hear this saying, don't we, that diversity is the mix and inclusion is about how do you make the mix work. But Fabienne, who's written the comment, has said that in their view, diversity is measurable, but inclusion is evaluable. So it may not be something that's kind of measurable in the same way, but it's certainly something that can be evaluated. The research, of course, is founded or took as its starting point, and I think confirmed that inclusion is measurable. But I wonder if either Marion or Mary, you have anything to say to Fabienne about this distinction between something being measurable and something, diversity being measurable and inclusion being evaluable. Does that mean anything to you?
Yes, I'd like to start, please, Sarah.
Please,
and actually, yeah, there's a very important point I forgot to make, so I'm going to come back to that other point. But to answer Fabienne's comment, in some ways, I think that this is just a sort of semantic distinction. there is a long tradition of measuring perceptions and feelings. I don't think we have to apologize for that. Evaluation is a form of measurement. You know, if you talk about program evaluation or program assessment, they're all measurement tools. So I would say, I think that diversity is much easier to measure. And in our research, we saw companies getting mixed up and asking questions, you know, looking at things like, oh, what's the percentage of women in our senior executive level? Or what's the attrition rate of women? Oh, we've gotten better. That means we're more inclusive. But that doesn't really measure inclusiveness. It may or may not be symptomatic of inclusiveness. It's really just it's not telling you anything about what people experience or feel. You know, you could, for example, it could be in a downturn in the economy and people are just more hesitant to leave the organization. So I wouldn't, if it works in your organization to make that distinction, great. But I wouldn't personally, to me, those are not such important differences. And the piece that I would just add, because I don't want to forget it, and I think it's so important, and Marion could, you know, still comment on Fabienne's if she'd like to, but what I forgot to say that I really want to emphasize is that if you only ask questions that are very generic, like I feel included in my organization, I feel my voice is listened to, I feel like I have career opportunities equal to those of other people. Those are all sort of global questions that ask people to almost average all their experiences, all the places that they live and work and operate in the organization, and it doesn't tell you anything about where the problem is. So I think another important thing is when you're asking questions, be very clear about the context. You may even repeat the questions. In my work group, I feel this, I experience that. In the organization overall, this is my experience, or this is the commitment I see to inclusion, because it's important to distinguish, because how else will you know where to intervene or what you need to do, what is broken and needs to be fixed. Yeah. Sorry for that diversion, but I think it's such an important point.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, we hear a lot, don't we, about using employee, you know, people surveys as a way of getting to understand people's experience of inclusion. But Mary, I wonder if you could say a bit more about this third way of measuring inclusion, which is around new data collection and analytical approaches. What did you encounter when you were doing the research?
So this is really exciting, and I think our fascination with it was validated by one of our D&I experts whom we interviewed, who said he thinks in the future that companies will have the data companies have and the insights they have about inclusion will be so much better because of this technology that many of the challenges we've talked about will simply go away. So here are a couple examples. And I realize for European audiences, some of these may raise concerns about data privacy, and yet I can assure you that all of these things are being used in Europe, and they can be managed in a way that meets or exceeds GDPR. So at any rate, let me give you some examples. One of these is analysis of the headers and the subject lines and the timing of emails, not the body of the emails. But this, by analyzing this data, a third party would analyze it, you can begin to see the networks of connection within your organization. And you could, for example, compare the organizational networks of men versus women. Is there an appreciable difference? Or do women who get promoted have a different kind of network and pattern of interactions within the organization than women who don't get promoted, or than men? And with these insights, you can begin to, perhaps come up with coaching. Or in one organization, it led to the design of sort of action research projects, because they saw that women who had relationships and who worked with senior men were promoted, and women who did not had less promotion. So they said, let's structure projects where up and coming hypo women have the opportunity to collaborate with executive level men, because we know that's going to be a factor in their promotion. So that's one example. I'll just mention a second one. There is, developed at MIT, are these electronic sensing devices that are worn by employees in the workplace. This only is done in a workplace where 90% of employees agree to do this on a short-term experimental basis. There's no point in doing it unless you have a very, significant participation. So there's a lot of time spent up front in assuaging and addressing employees' concerns. No, we don't measure how often you go to the restroom, etc. But these badges collect data about face-to-face interactions, not the content, but again, who interacts with whom, how often. But in addition, they collect data about conversational patterns. So are we taking turns? Who is it who always initiates the conversation? Does one person interrupt a lot, talk really fast, not give chances to the other person? This data is anonymized, and it can be shared with the organization in an aggregated, anonymous basis. But also, individuals can elect to get their own personal report, and that can be compared to the interaction patterns of others, high performers, let's say, or of another group, so that with this real-time feedback, you spend 80% of your time interacting with people who are lower in the organization than you do, and 15% with your peers and 5% with more senior people. And compared to the top performers in your role, here's the difference. Then I, as an individual, armed with this data, can begin making changes in my behavior, little experiments to see what happens. Or as a D&I professional, I can look at these patterns and say, we really need to coach women on, or senior men, if they care about women's advancement, need to be aware of the communication patterns that thwart women, that don't give them a chance. So these are just two examples of the way technology and greater expertise in collecting and analyzing data can give us much deeper insights about behaviors that encourage inclusion and perhaps behaviors that block it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Mary, and also a little bit sinister somehow as well. I don't know, there is kind of something a bit uncomfortable about that, isn't there? But and I guess a question that's raised by what you were saying is, in the research, did you come across anything around reporting of inclusion? Because obviously there's defining it, there's measuring it, and then there's so what? Who's getting? How are the insights into people's experiences, organizations' experiences of inclusion being reported to see and to who? So are senior leadership interested and engaged in measures of inclusion, and what are they doing about it? I'm really curious to know whether the research unearthed anything on that.
I'm recalling a recent presentation I did for one of our member companies where the CHRO said, we're beginning to see demand from shareholders and maybe VCs as well for reporting on this very issue. And so she saw this as perhaps becoming increasingly important, or a differentiator. I mean, if you think of all the issues in high tech about women, the ability to show, or even in terms of talent acquisition or branding, the ability to show a difference in culture and measure it so that people aren't just getting that information from Glassdoor could be a real competitive advantage. Yeah.
And I think that in a related way, we are seeing in our engagement council, one of the topics that's coming up for discussion in the next meeting is this growing demand, as Mary says, and interest among investors and also regulators about cultural measurements. And so, for example, in the banking industry, there's been a real development in having to being required to report to your board about engagement and it's very much associated with trust and also speak out culture. And it is connected with the whole banking scandals, but certainly our engagement practitioners really think that sort of cultural based reporting is very much on its way in, and they need to be ahead of it. And I think if that's happening in engagement, I think it's very likely to happen also in diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, and in fact, Marion, if I'm not wrong, Conference Board is doing some research later on this year on the links between inclusion and engagement, I think.
Yes, we are at the end of the year.
Yeah, that'll be a really interesting study. I mean, it's just back on the sort of research side of things. We've had a couple of questions about methodology. One around the number of companies and from which countries were involved in the analysis, and whether you're able to break out the norms by country, albeit on a qualitative basis. I mean, I'm imagining you won't be able to share. I understand you won't be able to share the names of companies, but is there any insight you can give the people who've asked those questions about breadth and sector, maybe in terms of companies? Yeah.
I mean, I think we can sort of say in terms of the research, we conducted it through interviews with D&I leaders and subject matter experts, and so we held focus groups with our Diversity and Inclusion Council in Europe and our corresponding councils in the US. We also talked to our advisory board in our D&I Institute, and we talked to a number of companies. We have named some of them in the report, but they include Jones Lang LaSalle, Bill, Hilton, Dow DuPont, Skanska, Bristol Myers Squibb, as well as off the record conversations too. So it was very much, because of the nature of the research, very much an interview-led and focus group-led research. We didn't, as you say, Sarah, we didn't break out the norms and the results by country. And in our next research into, what does inclusion mean in a sort of global context, there might be scope to do that.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I would just add that we are in general at the Conference Board really careful about including companies from the major regions, that is Asia Pacific, Europe, and North America. So that was really represented. And virtually almost all of the companies were global. And when you add up the D&I Council, 3 D&I Council members, the Institute Advisory Board, and the interviews we did, I would say we probably had input from about 70 companies all told.
Right. Yeah, and I think something else to say was that we also had the great privilege to go to our Human Capital Analytics Institute and Council there to get their perspective, because this is a very vital stakeholder in the whole area of measuring inclusion, and they have some great insights and some great expertise that that they can give to D&I leaders for measuring inclusion.
Thank you, Marion. Thank you, Mary. I know that all of us could probably keep on talking about measuring and defining inclusion for a long time, but I think that probably concludes the content for today's session. Thank you both for being, having so much to say about defining measuring inclusion, for getting so involved in the research, and obviously for being on the webinar. And thank you to everybody who's been on the webinar itself. If you can as the slide in front of you shows, you can download the research report. You can listen to a webcast or podcast of Linda Leonard from Bristol Myers Squibb talking about their work on inclusion, which is a really fascinating webcast. If you want to know more about the European Diversity and Inclusion in Business Council, please do contact me. It's a really fantastic network and a real, for sharing insights and gathering solutions from diversity inclusion executives from across the sectors. So please do keep an eye out for that. And also, finally, if we can ask you to submit the evaluation form for today's webcast, that would be much appreciated. Thank you very much indeed.